private panel conversation. We just briefly say who is here and then we will cover. We are honored to have all four panelists here. Representative Robert Johnson has been a member of the Mississippi Legislature for the past 29 years, serving in both the House and the Senate. He is chair of the Mississippi Democratic Caucus and practices law in some of the toughest jurisdictions in Mississippi and the Southeast. I have to tell you that Representative Johnson, I just appreciate you so much. He carried us on his back during this past legislative session. It was one of the worst. I mean, we had some bad ones, but this was a doozy. And you know, being in the minority, but also trying to work a process and hold people together and move an agenda and be as bipartisan as possible to try to help us move issues for children and families in the state. He is a stalwart. And he didn't just get that way. He led the fight to get rid of the Mississippi state flag as well. He's been on national TV all over. Some of you all might have seen him. Following Representative Johnson will be Attorney Brandon Jones, who used to be in the legislature, but decided that we needed help on the outside. So Brandon is now the director of political campaigns for the Southern Poverty Law Center, overseeing various advocacy campaigns advancing the SPLC's mission of racial justice in the Deep South. Brandon leads their C4 work pretty much, and Dr. Wilson had advised that he wanted the board to hear more about C4 activities going on in the state and what the needs were. Another stalwart has been and has been of yeoman service to the Children's Defense Fund over the years, and particularly in this last year, is Attorney Phaedra Braden Robinson. Phaedra is the principal of the Braden Consultant Group, a consulting firm providing support and technical assistance to social justice advocacy organizations and small businesses in Mississippi. Phaedra has been addressing civil rights and consumer protection issues for more than 20 years through policy advocacy, community education, coalition building, and legal redress. And several years ago, prior to COVID, ran one of the strongest campaigns anywhere in the South that took on predatory lending institutions. And we might have won it if it hadn't been for some Black legislators. You leave that where it is. Maisie Brown. Miss Maisie Brown is a 21-year-old Mississippi native activist and organizer. Upon graduation from Murrah High School, she co-organized Jackson's Black Lives Matter protest in the summer of 2020. That was the largest protest since the 1960s civil rights era in the state of Mississippi. She has been featured in publications and news outlets such as Glamour Magazine, Teen, Vogue, and Essence, surrounding her advocacy and organizing work during the Jackson water crisis. She is currently a senior political science student at Jackson State University. LaFonza didn't get here yet? Okay. We've been doing Jackson State 2 stuff all and the advocacy and organizing coordinator at the ACLU of Mississippi. She was recently named Jackson State University's first ever Truman Scholar. And has been actively engaged in our work with young Black women from across the South, rural areas of the South, through our Unita Blackwell Young Women's Leadership Program led by the auspicious Amanda Fudge, who has also brought in young people, and we'll hear more from Amanda later. So with that, I think, Robert, the issue at hand, y'all know well, the conversations we're having. The title is Democracy Under Siege in Mississippi, Fighting Efforts to Suppress the Will of Black and Marginalized Citizens. So take it away.
Well, thank you. That's a heavy load to carry starting out, but I'm on a good panel, so I got plenty of backup. I want to say something about a leader talked about me helping to lead the charge to get the flag changed. I want to say that charge was led by Maisie Brown. I tell people all the time that Black Lives Matter protest, the number of people who showed that effort gave us the energy we needed to get things done in the legislature. So we appreciate that kind of effort. Which goes back to what I always tell people in the legislature. Look, as we try to find candidates to get people to run, don't send any more old people up here. Get us some young people, please. We need that energy. We need those ideas. And this session was one that was as telling as ever about the predicament we find ourselves in. I spent more time on the phone with Brandon and Phaedra and Olita and people like that about issues that we were dealing with the whole time. And what's funny is that probably, in my opinion, the thing that was more indicative of about how far we removed ourselves from democracy is that we still have the highest rate of poverty among children in the Delta. We still have hospitals about to close. We had people in the middle of a tornado having to drive 40 miles to a hospital, not because the hospital had been destroyed by the tornado, but because the hospital was closed because the state of Mississippi refused to take Medicaid expansion in areas that would really help. I mean, if you live in Belzona, Humphreys County, a lady had to drive a child 40 miles to an emergency room because there's no hospital. My context is that if democracy was alive, those are the issues we'd be debating and working on in the legislature. But we didn't even take the time to figure out where $95 million of poor people's money went while we were in the legislature. What we did was spend the inordinate amount of time figuring out a way to take over the city of Jackson. Yes. Take over the city of Jackson, a city that has over 28,000 state employees downtown, that most of whom don't live there. State office buildings, there's no fee in kind payment, no taxes being paid. And so when this same leadership who would never spend any money to help the city of Jackson, even though they put the most stress on the infrastructure. When you talk about water, sewer, and how bad a shape it's in, that comes from the state. That's where the stress comes from, not just from the citizens of the city of Jackson. And then they turn around and in an effort to place blame on the city, on their leadership and their inability to do something. We spent the whole session figuring out a way to take over a city when all you have to do is spend the money that's necessary to make sure that infrastructure and it works. And it brings me back to my other point, is that I tell all my friends all the time, we talk about ideas, we talk about philosophy, we talk about what we want to move politically, but none of that means anything unless you're talking about money. I mean, money is, I don't care about what your idea, I don't care if you want public education to do better, you want better roads, but if you are not shaping policy with money, you're wasting your time. And that's what this new fascism does. They spend all their time. They did this whole session talking about, well, we want to fight crime in Jackson. You don't fight crime in Jackson by hiring more policemen. Even though if you wanted to hire more policemen, give it to the city of Jackson, let them hire their own police. If you really want to fight crime, put some money into these neighborhoods, do community policing, do economic development in an area that needs it. And that changes people's lives. It changes the culture. It changes the environment. But I'm telling people things that people know already. And I kept telling the delegation from Hinds County, I said, look, stop being led into this discussion about, well, people care about crime. No, people care about every big box store leaving Jackson. They care about every industry, every firm, corporate taxpayer that you need leaving the city of Jackson. That's what they care about. They don't know they care about that, but that's your job to tell them that's what they care about. So I don't care if you put 200 more Capitol Police in the city of Jackson. If there's no tax base, if there's no environment of progress and economic development and hope for the people in the city of Jackson, then you're doing nothing. And I spend all my time, all the time. People tell me all the time, Robert, you're always talking about money. I said, that is the red herring, and that is where we missed the point. They're talking about fighting crime, and we need to be talking about the fact that that the city of Jackson is our capital city. And where do you invest in the city of Jackson? Where do you do urban economic development? Where do you take blighted areas and put money into those blighted areas and clean it up and make it a place where people want to live and they invested in? And if you don't do that, then you're wasting your time. And the frustration was, I'm gonna stop on this, is that I had members of you talk about black legislators. I had black legislators going into meetings, sitting down. Well, they say they're gonna expand the area and bring more police. I said, well, you stop talking to them about police. They have not over a 10-year period. I personally, with some other legislators, went and tracked the legislation for Hinds County. I said, let me show you a list of what you've asked for, that you said no to, that they've said no to. And all the money that they say that you've misspent, this is the money that they have not appropriated to your city. You need to be able to establish your record. Your record is that we've asked and we've been denied. And so you can't ask a man to build something if he doesn't have the resources. But you want to fix the water system, you want to fix the sewer system, and you have not appropriated the requisite amount of money to get that done, even though you've asked and requested it. And as a firm indication of that's the attitude in this leadership, Jackson asked simply for two things this session: $1 million for the planetarium, $1 million. If anybody been to the parking lot at the convention center? Looked like somebody dropped a bomb on it.
Yes.
I mean, it's like that. They only asked for $1 million just to get that fixed. The governor, in a $700 million bill, found a way to veto $2 million for the city of Jackson, $500,000 for the city of Greenville. Both have black mayors. And so when we stand up on the floor of the House and say, look, let me tell you something, and to quote my good colleague, Solomon Osborne, it looks like y'all traded those hoods and sheets for suits, because this is a racist action. This is not a political action. This is not a financial action. When you consciously find a reason to say no to somebody about something as insignificant as paving a parking lot, you're sending me the message I need to hear. I need to know where I stand and who I am. And this is where the fight will be engaged. And that's the fight we have to deal with.
Well, we've been gerrymandered to hell and back, like most of the Deep South, but we don't want for brilliant political leadership. I think we're all very lucky here in Mississippi that we had Robert Johnson sticking his finger into the dike this year. This has been an incredible fight, and this year has been, from a morale standpoint, just they're starting to figure out this leadership thing, which is a frightening prospect. They're getting a little bit more efficient over there at the Capitol building, and so it's been even more challenging. So grateful for you. Want to say grateful for the Children's Defense Fund. I don't know where we would be in terms of our organizing and coalition building if it weren't for the Children's Defense Fund and the leadership of Olita Fitzgerald. There are a lot of people who have a claim to the flag change and to removing Jim Crow pieces from our Constitution, but Olita was there at all of those meetings, getting us on the phone, making sure we didn't give up, making sure we were hitting all of our points. And so tremendous gratitude to her and to your organization. And very excited that you're back here and thinking about new ways to impact Mississippi and the rest of the country. I think, Olita, what we see now is this Shelby versus Holder in sort of full bloom. We're coming up on the anniversary of that Supreme Court decision in about 60 days. And for those of you who might remember, in 2013, the Supreme Court said that Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act was no longer needed. That this notion that states like Mississippi and those states throughout the country who had a racist past and who had a way of disenfranchising voters no longer had to submit their plans around voting to the Department of Justice. And so when that happened, the scrutiny around things such as redistricting was dropped. The scrutiny around things such as voting rights laws, early voting, absentee voting, all of those things went by the wayside. And so now in this 10th year, and about 3 years past redistricting for most of our states, the 2020 census is that kind of mark when legislatures redistrict. We're now sort of seeing that swing into full gear, and we're seeing it across the country. So Robert has seen it firsthand. We passed 3 bills that will allow the Secretary of State and others to purge voters. We've already had some kind of scary voter purging going on even before these bills, but now it's been institutionalized. We saw the same thing happened in Florida and Georgia in 2021. Some of those bills are still being attacked in the court system. We've even taken away the ability in many of our states to bring someone a glass of water or an apple if they're standing in line for 6 hours, never mind addressing the underlying reason why they are standing in line in the first place. We've taken away weekend voting. We've narrowed the time when people can vote early. In runoffs in Georgia, that time has shrunk. We've taken away voting boxes. That's not a Southern problem. They've done that in Ohio too and throughout the country, but they've definitely done it in Georgia and Florida. DeSantis, his efficiency with attacking voting rights should be something that scares us all. And he's even instituted anti-democratic concepts that allows him to self-select local representatives. And so if he does not like the way someone in local elected office is behaving, he can unilaterally replace that person and has used that authority. And so it's sort of like House Bill 1020 on steroids throughout the state. That's just a portion, that's just a slice of what we're seeing across the South. And so I think the questions that organizations like the Children's Defense Fund and that the Southern Poverty Law Center and all of us have to be thinking about is what are we going to do about it, and how are we going to develop our response? And I think for a long time we've done what my former colleague in the Mississippi Senate used to say: we're playing checkers while they're playing football. The truth of the matter is, a lot of these things that we are encountering are by design. Dobbs didn't happen by accident. The decision that we saw just last week that took us from we were actually number one in a very important category that had to do with protecting our kids with vaccines. And that charge to take that away was led by a out-of-state Texas group that organized, got some folks. If you look at that plaintiff list, it's unrecognizable to people from Mississippi. It's almost all out-of-state AstroTurf. And so we have to ask ourselves as progressives and as people who care about these issues, whether or not we're going to bring our full tools to bear on some of these challenges. And so I think it's important that we recognize that there are distinctions between these different entities that give us different political latitude. C3s do enormous work, and there will always be a place for C3s in states throughout the country. But this ability of C4s to lobby without limitation, to help people like Robert, to provide staff and funding to make sure that our voices are heard at the Capitol is crucial. And that's one of the things that C4s unlock for us. The other thing is this ability to spend political dollars and to get involved. I think there was a sense a few years back when Citizens United passed that we didn't want to play dirty. We didn't want to do the things that they were doing because there was something different about us. And I think there is something different about us, and I'm sympathetic to that view. But we can't be following the rules of a debutante ball while they're behaving in the way that they are and burning our houses down and taking away our rights. So we're going to have to engage because there's no real logical solution but engagement. And so a C4 allows us to endorse candidates, which is increasingly important because the people that we interact with and the people that we organize with, it's important that they know how we feel about issues and how we feel about political candidates. And then, of course, there are other tools in the toolbox that I hope we see utilized in places like Mississippi more, things like independent expenditure campaigns, which I'm looking forward to being involved in one of those as we move towards November here in Mississippi. PAC activity, all of the full menu of services and organizations that you see in other states where you happen to see us having some success from a progressive standpoint. I thought it was notable that if you look at the states in the South that have C4 roundtables, these are those organizations that get all of the do-gooder groups together to make sure they're pulling in the right direction and that they're properly allocating resources. If you look at those states, North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, 2 of those 3 have delivered tremendous victories within the last 6 months. In Georgia, the re-election of Raphael Warnock, which helped the United States Senate to stay in Democratic control, not insignificant to any of the issues that we've talked about here today. And then in North Carolina, just last month, signing Medicaid expansion into law in that state. It's not an accident that those breakthroughs happen in places where you have organization and where you have the full weight of C4s leaning on these problems. The good news is, as I said a moment ago, we don't want for good leadership. We have great minds. We need to make sure we're providing leaders like Maisie with the full complement of activity and tools. And so I'm going to continue to beat this. Whenever Olita said, I want you to talk to the board and talk to them a little bit about the importance of C4s and a little bit about the importance of organization. Well, you all know organization, and many of you know C4s. But you couldn't believe how much a little bit of organization here, how much having the Children's Defense Fund C4 responding to some of these things so that we can do it in concert could mean to some of these problems. Just a couple more things I want to point out for those of you who may not be familiar with things in the Deep South. Robert mentioned Medicaid expansion, and I don't think there's any more crucial issue that we face here, but it's notable that of the 10 states that have not expanded Medicaid, 6 of them are in the Deep South, and the other one is Texas. So, I mean, this region is really a place where we have to look for that type of change in leadership. I think that's it for now, but thank you for letting us be here.
Have questions, so thank you both. I'd like to come back on a couple of things, but I'll just continue to go with the panel because I want to get everybody's voices in before we come back to questions. Phaedra, you were in there lead advocate on a lot of issues, one of which was expansion of postpartum coverage for women after birth from 60 days to 12 months. That cost very little for the state. You talk a little bit about not only that work, but about how the system worked different this year in terms of having voice in a democratic process.
Sure. As Olita said, this has been the most reprehensible session that I have ever seen in the state of Mississippi. I formerly worked for the House of Representatives, so I've seen it from the inside and how it should function. I've been an advocate for a number of years, and my analogy has always been in trying to do progressive policy in Mississippi. It's truly an uphill battle, but the hill is made of butter and it's coated in olive oil. So how do you make that happen when you have people both inside and outside who refuse to see the communities that we're working for, that we're working on behalf of in the state of Mississippi? One of the issues that came to light that had always been a challenge has been Medicaid. And we knew early on that there was an issue with Medicaid because we had more Black women dying after birth than any other state in this country. And people were okay with that. And we worked as advocates. We took the charge and said, we have to do something. This is something that's winnable. And we thought it was early on, but we fought this battle for 10 years or so. Yeah, so a lot of women have died because people decided that it was okay for women to only have 60 days of Medicaid coverage postpartum. Of that, Black women were dying at a rate of 8 times more than any other race in the country. In particular, in Mississippi, our numbers were scary. They would keep you up at night knowing that these women who gave birth to these babies were now no longer with us. Now, not only was that a life loss, but now the child suffers. So we have been rallying and organizing and coming together and having some really great strategies, but our strategies did not penetrate in the way that they should. This year, we took it up a notch and we brought on any particular segment of the community that we thought could give voice to the challenge that we were facing. So we had the medical community who during their White Coat Day made this their one of their primary issues that they lobbied for. So we worked with them to assist in developing communication strategies. We shared the same messaging across all of our communities. We worked with the faith-based community to give voice to their thoughts and feelings on what was happening with the loss of mothers postpartum. We had the business community to speak about this because again, they're losing employees, they're being impacted because women are dying, women were suffering. We did all of this and we were feeling so great, but we were still not getting the traction we needed. That was until there was a candidate that entered the governor's race. And all of a sudden, now what we say makes sense. Olita and I had a conversation last year, and I don't know, we can't repeat it in the company we're currently in, but we were beyond frustrated because the response of the speaker was, well, we're not sure about the data. We don't know about these numbers. And the numbers were generated by a state agency that he relied on for everything else, but yet when it came to postpartum, he wasn't sure about the data in the reports. And you can imagine the frustration we felt because we are considering what's happening in communities. In rural spaces in this state, you have people that don't have access to a hospital. You have community clinics that are overwhelmed because they are trying to close the gap for those that need services. We have not expanded Medicaid. And as we sit here today, we are facing a medical health crisis with the number of rural hospitals that are likely to close over the next 2 to 3 years. A third of our rural hospitals are at risk of closure. Yeah. We don't have a neonatal intensive care unit in the Mississippi Delta. Yeah. And we continue to refuse to expand Medicaid. So we use all of this as a platform to discuss postpartum expansion. It would cost the state, I think it was an additional $3 million to expand postpartum coverage for mothers. So it wasn't about money. It was about the fact that these women's lives were disposable to them because they were Black women. It was not impacting their communities at the rate that it was ours. And so we included some of that in our messaging, and we try to be nice. We can't be too radical all the time and get things done. But we finally were able to move the needle. And again, the efforts that we did this year were efforts that we had done in prior years. We just ramped it up a little bit, but we had a little thing working in our favor. They were losing the votes of white women because of the Dobbs decision. So something had to be done. And thank God they thought of Black women who were dying after giving birth. So now we have postpartum coverage in the state of Mississippi for women that now will include an additional 10 months of service. And we're still battling with the Department of Medicaid because they can't tell us how their process will work. The legislation has been signed into law, and we've yet to have any information released from the Division of Medicaid to tell us what their process will look like and what will it be continuous care? Will there be a recertification process? Is it retroactive for this year? So again, still at the helm, still trying to get answers, still trying to push for the resources that our communities need that are available. And as Robert said, it's not about economics. It's truly not.
Thank you, Phaedra. And I'll just say in there, just plug something. We also saw within the advocacy community this year some impact on mental health. Yes. Because people were putting their whole being into this work. So we saw people melting. And it's just a horrible experience to have witnessed, but I'll come back to that. I don't want to take away, Maisie, from your perspective as a young person over the last couple of years and your involvement in democratic processes, from yours and representative of the other young people who have joined us today, can you talk about a little bit about what you all see, what you all think we're not doing, and what you think we need to be more engaged in? And again, this is Truman Fellow who's going to talk to us right now.
Thank you.
She's also a Jackson State person. And
Yes.
she had a boardwalk there. This Jackson State Tulu thing.
Yes.
Lord, so
Proud Jackson State.
Yes.
amazing.
I think that right now we are, as just a young person, at a university here with a bunch of other young people who are like 99% progressive and ready to move forward and ready to see a better society. I think that what we see going on here in Mississippi makes it really, really hard to convince somebody to stay here after they graduate. Even people who are from Jackson have been here all their lives. It's like now, it's like we could tolerate it as we were getting younger because we really didn't feel the impacts in the way that we do as adults, especially as women. And so when you have the time here when she just talked about, we just got postpartum Medicaid expansion for a lot of young women that I know rely on Medicaid to get these services and were being denied those services in the past. So that was also an issue. And then it was already hard to get an abortion if you wanted one, but at least there was still the option. So now that there is not an option, that's like strike 2. 3, a lot of young people, especially at Jackson State, especially who weren't from here, were completely baffled by the water crisis. They didn't even know what boil water notices were. They weren't used to having to go and get cases of water. I grew up doing that with my grand. That was just a part of it, and so for them to go days and days without running water, or the water was running brown, or giving people weird rashes, and being in college and having to use portable bathrooms and showers, it's like, what incentive again do I have to stay here and suffer through this? And so I think for a lot of young people now, it's like, why would I suffer here when I can move this place 2 states over and I can make this amount of money? I don't have to worry about my water running and, whatever the case may be. And so right now we're in a really sticky situation on maintaining our young progressive crowd, because now it's like, why would I sit here and fight so hard when like what I'm saying isn't radical someplace 500 miles away? Like, why is healthcare a debatable issue when I wouldn't have that problem? I'll still be able to get an abortion. I'll still be able to make sure my kids have cover. We have to think about those types of things now, because it's like, wow, we're the new adults. And so it's really hard. It's a really sticky situation. And Jackson State is just it's so funny, like when you're on campus and around people, because you really do become like, you're like in a bubble of just other like young Black people. Like everybody believes you have rights to this and rights. Like it just seems so common sense when you're in that bubble. But when you step outside the campus and when you go to other parts of the state, it's like, this is not the reality for a lot of different people. And so I think that those are my friends, y'all. All of my friends, like they were a part of the team that we assembled in July of last year with delivering water. And so we had like a water delivery hotline that was specifically for elderly households, for disabled households. And they would call, and the conditions that we would see, the need that we would see. I mean, it's like, it's out there, but until you're really confronted with it and you're seeing it day in, day out. I mean, we had like little kids calling who live with their grandparents because they couldn't get out to get the water and they hadn't had water in days. And so when you see those types of conditions, and then they have to go into school and function and pass state tests and show up and be present, and just all of these different factors. I mean, even when I was in starting, I was at the Boys and Girls Club. I mean, spring break, we were during spring break. I was with the 6 and 7 year old group, and we heard about this new thing called COVID. We were like, man, what's that hurt? It's like the flu, that's like a bad flu. We're going to get a few days extra out of school. We were like, okay, cool. We get some extra days out of school, which turned into never returning. But even then with, going back, helping them, because at that point, we had to assemble food boxes. We had some donations from different companies. So we were assembling cereal, fruit, milk, all this type of stuff, because now kids were missing their 2 meals a day that they were getting from school. And so, again, delivering to those households, the kids, hey, can I get like an extra box because we probably not gonna have anything until this time tomorrow, this time the next day. And so, again, these are the same kids that have to show up and pass state tests and be present and be quiet and be still. It's just so many different factors. And so I think that right now, again, with all the issues that we're talking about, we're not only going through a crisis with our democracy, with these issues, we're going through a crisis that we're about to lose our last leg of like young progressive people who can tolerate being here. Because now it's like our parents necessarily, or our grandparents necessarily have the opportunity to leave in the way that they wanted to, when it was even rougher out here. But now that we do, it's like, okay, deuces, bye. And so it's tough. And so it's really bad. I think the water crisis again was like the breaking point for a lot of young people. Just like it was already hard, but now you're telling me I can't even brush my teeth or like take a shower without, coming up with a plan to do that. It's a real thing.
Thanks, Maisie. You gave me chills talking about the children and the children asking for food to carry over until the next day, and the conditions that we live in terms of poverty in the state. The statewide poverty levels, and I know we got some State of America's Children data. Statewide poverty level, when we talk about statewide, is one thing, but when we talk about the poverty level among Black and brown children, we're talking about 1 in every 2 children. So when you're in an environment when half of the people you see, and when you're coming to school at JPS, you might be talking about 75%. Of the children there living at or below the poverty level. And all of those things stacked on top of that. I'd like to ask you talked about the water crisis and a lot of things. One of the things that, we fight for every year in the state of Mississippi is adequate funding for public schools. Can you give us just a snippet about what your view is of the education system for our children? And I'll go K-12, we can go early childhood, that's a whole panel in and of itself, but just what you see and what your experience, what of our experiences about where our children are getting an education that will allow them to be competitive in a 21st century world.
Right. So that's actually one of the things that in my Truman pilot, we had to write a policy proposal. I talked about fully funding education and the implementation of community school models and different things like that. In going to Jackson Public Schools, 2 of my friends went to JPS with me, and it was definitely, I don't think we realized how different our experiences were until we traveled to other schools in the area. And so I went to Murrah High School, and we were that was my mic. Oh, I don't know what that was. We were, the only team in JPS at the time who had a speech and debate team. And so I was one of the speech and debate captains during high school, and we would travel. Mr. Everson, my coach and teacher there, I took him for all 3 years I was at Murrah. He was a trooper. Like, Mr. Everson was door dashing after school. He was doing Lyft before school. We would travel to tournaments every weekend. We would be going to Oxford, to the coast. We went to Atlanta one time. We went to Dallas. Like, we made it happen strictly out of our parents' pockets most of the time because we did not get any funding from school to do that for real. We had to pay for our own bus, make sure to pay the bus driver. I would literally remember when we would stop at the Walmart in Canton before we got on the road to go to that Subway in there to get our lunch before we left. And I would ask the bus driver, you need something to eat? You want me to get you a sandwich? I'm getting a sandwich. It was a community effort. And we would travel to these schools. And my first time, I think I was at Oxford High School. I don't know if you've ever been to Oxford High School. It looks like a community college. It is nice. And so we walked in there. We were like, oh, wow. We would look, there were flat screen TVs all down the hallway. And it was actually incredible. And when I thought about the fact that they had just such a surplus just to make the school just look pretty, And my AP US history teacher was having to photocopy chapters out of all of the books because there weren't enough to send home. I'm like, this is a problem. And so I would say that, well, one thing about my experience in school is, though, even though we had a lot less, our teachers really, really went into overdrive to make sure we didn't feel that. And so our teachers were incredibly resourceful. They had side hustles. They were working at Belk and things on weekends. Like, they were making it happen for us so we wouldn't quite feel it. But the older we got, we became more cognizant of those differences. And just, I was so blessed to have a really, really good elementary school experience here, and the ability to go to pre-K and different things like that, because that has made the world of difference. Like, I would argue that my K through 6 experience has been the most impactful for like life. I can tell, like, we can tell within even like within classrooms, the kids who like went to pre-K and like had a good elementary school experience versus those who didn't. Because those who couldn't read then can't read now. And those who read then were still reading now. And so it was a huge stark difference. Like, I was taking the ACT and thinking about things like my 6th grade math teacher was telling me, like, while I'm sitting here taking this test. Because, I mean, I always tell people, I'm like, the ACT English section is like a 5th grade, like, it's like an English test. Like, those rules that you are doing now, like that, you've been stopped learning about that. You don't even learn about different grammar rules like that in high school. That's all elementary school. And so just knowing that so many kids are already being counted out or have strikes against them just because they didn't have a teacher K through 3, which is a real reality for a lot of students in Mississippi, especially right here in Jackson. We have an extreme teacher shortage. We have teachers walking out, like quitting in the middle of the year because they're like, I don't get paid enough to do this. Like, I have several teachers now who have like quit and gone to nursing school and gone to this. Like, they've completely taken career change paths because it's just like, I do not feel supported in this work. I am not being paid enough for this work. I have too many students. The classroom was falling apart. Then I reconfiguring. So it's just so many different factors that are not only pushing students out of the schools, but teachers out of the classrooms. And so if that is not fixed, we're going to continuously see the problem of people being functionally illiterate. We're going to continue seeing the problem of, poverty in our neighborhoods and no community development. And we're not seeing any new businesses pop up. I mean, Chipotle, I don't know about y'all, but I've never had Chipotle before. And so we just got one in Ridgeland. Well, now we're getting one in Ridgeland, Madison, Pearl, and Flowood. Everywhere but Jackson. Every suburb in this area is getting a Chipotle but Jackson. And while it may sound trivial because, it's just Chipotle, it's like a bigger thing of like, people are going out of their way to not invest in this community. And I don't know a burrito that good, but I mean, it's a real thing.
Thank you, Daisy. So we're going to end with the round. I want to go back to tying these policy issues to an anti-democracy or anti-democratic process. I know you all have all heard about the TANF debacle and the debacle, it was just pure theft of resources from poor families in the state of Mississippi. Factoid. Mississippi has a population of about 3 million people. There are less than 3,000 people on welfare getting cash assistance in the state of Mississippi. Less than 3,000, and most of those are children. The turn down rate for poor families applying for TANF is 80%. After all the theft and all of the news about the theft, brother, can you talk just a bit about the reception you all received from the hearing on TANF and the submission of legislation and what the leadership had to say about that?
Well, you all were involved in helping us put it together, and probably the best indication of what the leadership's attitude was. We were putting a hearing together, and the Senate, the lieutenant governor said he wouldn't broadcast it on the website because there were Democrats putting it on. Even though no Republican, no official legislative chairman had asked to have a hearing to investigate. We have a public health chairman, a Medicaid chairman, a public health chairman in the House and the Senate. And neither one of them over that summer asked to have a hearing to figure out where the money went. So we said, look, nobody's asking. We want to be able to craft legislation to address these issues. So we're going to have a hearing. And the lieutenant governor said, no, the public can't see it because it looks like it's a partisan. So what's partisan about asking where did our $95 million go? Right. And why are there people being turned down at a rate of 8-1 and families not getting money? Why is that happening? That's not a democratic issue. So that was the first indication. So we had those hearings. We had great testimony. We had great research from the state and from outside of the state. And we were able to craft real legislation. We actually got the Department of Human Services to weigh in and say, look, yeah, we need to do this. No, we have not been monitoring this $95 million we gave away. We have not been asking people to tell us whether or not you're actually performing. You're actually doing this work. In fact, that was one of the things Brandon called me. He said, look, you need to make sure you ask the question of, is there a monitoring system? If you're going to give $95 million away, are they actually serving people? There was nothing in place to do that. And so we introduced legislation to do that. Every piece of legislation we introduced never even made it out of off the chairman's desk. Never had a hearing, never had a question answered.
Just stay there a minute. The chairman's desk. But at the same time, the Republican caucus was meeting and even got, there was a lawsuit about whether or not they could do that. Can you talk a little bit about how those committee processes changed?
Well,
this past
traditionally, it's just not this year. Ever since it started with Haley Barbour. When Haley Barbour was governor, he instituted this partisan politics type issue. And so it began with the Republicans having caucus meetings. And so when they got to be a supermajority, it became even more difficult, even more undemocratic, because they would go in their caucus meeting and they would decide what legislation they would take up. They didn't bring it to the committee. They chaired every committee, but they wouldn't have a committee meeting and give you an opportunity to actually talk about your legislation. They would decide in their caucus meeting what legislation would be taken up. So the people of Mississippi didn't get to hear how they debated that in their caucus meeting. No member of the legislature, only if you were a Republican. Philip Gunn said it best at the Neshoba County Fair, 3 or 4 years ago. If you're not a Republican and your elected official is not a Republican, you will get nothing and nobody will hear what you have to say. He actually said that at a public meeting, and that's the way they operated. And that's not democracy.
On the postpartum coverage legislation proposal, when they did all of the shenanigans about bringing that legislation out, members of the press asked the chairman of the House Medicaid Committee if they were going to bring out Medicaid expansion. Mm-hmm. And his response in the news was, "This is the first time this committee has met, and it's going to be the last time this committee is meeting."
Well, to add insult to injury, he didn't even meet this session, period. I mean, he met, you would call it a meeting, but when Philip Gunn finally decided that there was too much pressure not to bring out postpartum, they essentially they really didn't have a meeting, they just brought the legislation forward. Yeah, it's just like a drive-by. And so, but I remember having a conversation. Let me tell you how, two things that the speaker said to me on postpartum. He said, I don't know why women would need more time to go back to work. You ought to be able to go back to work. I was in his office asking him to do that. And I gave him statistics about how bad it was. He literally and then on education, he said to me on education, on fully funding education, he said, it's like throwing money down a deep hole. A hole that you've never put money in. How would you know whether or not it's a waste if you've never spent? Yeah. But he said that he just sit there and said that. And his famous line about every piece of legislation is, nobody said anything to me about it. He said it about postpartum the first time. Nobody's complained to me about it. I'm like, you read some statistics, talk to somebody. Well, you had a group of Republican women pediatricians in his office with me, all white, saying this is what we need. And I'm thinking to myself, well, you could solve this problem. Stop voting for him. My goodness.
Yeah.
Paige, you want to say something?
That's all we need is 60 days. That's all.
I never told
I-
Phaedra this because I knew she by this time she had had enough. She didn't want to hear this.
I mean, it's really hard to listen to. It's hard
Yeah.
to stomach because if we would center families, if we would center Black women in these policies that they're creating,
Mhm.
then our state would be so much better. But
Much
we
better.
continue to deal with people with the attitudes of Philip Gunn, and at some point I have to quit blaming him. And I'm looking at the women that surround him because how are you married to this joke?
Right.
How does he get to show up at your family dinner and not get just roasted? How do we make it comfortable for them to exist in communities when they are destroying families? That to me is just unbelievable. And I just cannot continue to just take the strategies that we've been doing. We got to take it to the streets.
Yes.
It's gone on too long. Our people have suffered too much. We're talking about education and, teachers are leaving, but we have places in the Delta where there are no teachers, period.
Right.
And we don't have broadband coverage sufficient enough for them to do teleteach. So they're trying to learn from a video that keeps buffering and keeps dropping. So what do you learn at the end of the day? So we're failing our children, we're failing our communities because we continue to deal with these clowns at the legislature who are taking us for a joke. And they've gerrymandered us to death that even if everybody show up and vote, we can't vote them out.
Okay, let me, you raised something there. Phaedra and I and the coalitions all over the place are working really hard to make sure that when all this broadband money leaves is spent, that rural areas in the state have broadband coverage and our communities have broadband coverage and just not some stuff stuck to a pole that,
Right.
after we spend $1
Obsolete.
billion. And that's tedious work. That's really not funded work. I mean, it's really just the people know if we don't do this, it's not going to happen. So we are engaged in like 15 counties across the rural area of Mississippi to try to get this work done. But then the other thing that we want to talk about is not only are we jammed or getting jammed, and Brandon, I want to come back to you to end the panel to talk about how we can't continue to do business like we do it. You can't just be advocacy and electoral. You've got to, where we got to go there. But one of the other things we had to do is when federal money comes into this region, and you got governors that are ideologically opposed to whatever that policy is, they make it extremely difficult for people who are supposed to benefit from those dollars to access them. So Phaedra, one example of that was the ARPA funding. So can you just mention briefly, we had to actually get in gear, and all of this is unfunded stuff. All of this is not stuff we had on our agenda to do for that year. How we had to get in gear and coalesce to make sure people got the ramp money and the other funding. So can you speak a little bit about that, and then I'm gonna come back to you.
So in Mississippi, when the money came for the rental assistance program from the ARPA money, the geniuses at Mississippi Home Court decided that we should have an electronic only application process. So you had to upload documents, you had to fill out the application, everything was done online. In a state that lags behind in broadband with a high illiteracy rate, people didn't know what to do, so they weren't applying. So then they complained, well, people aren't applying. So we said we have to go to where the people are. So we organized with the Mississippi Association of Social Workers, and we started a tour across the hardest hit areas. And we went into the Mississippi Delta, into South Mississippi, and we did application clinics. We sat with people, filled out those applications, and had them submitted. We talked directly to Home Court to say, we have all these people who've shown up. We don't want them to mail it in. Can we deliver? So we had to go through all these steps in order to get people the help and the resources they need. And again, it was volunteerism. We were doing this on Saturdays. We were doing it late into the evenings. We would say we would be there 3 hours, but 100 people would show up and we couldn't get everybody done. We got put out in Yazoo City because the lady said we have to shut our doors, but we continue to help people in the parking lot. So we were doing all we could to make sure people had access and information. And our governor, in his wisdom, decided that people don't want to work because we were paying their rents. And they sent back over $80 million of this program when we still had people who were waiting on over $80 million. And we still had people who needed assistance, who could not get assistance because their system did not work. They didn't engage any of the advocates in that process. And when we made recommendations, they became upset, but there, again, barriers. Their application process did not work. The application was horrible. They were requiring more documents than the Treasury Department required them to capture for people who were applying. So again, advocates had to step in and speak on behalf of community and push back against what was happening with that program. And we still lost out in the end because the governor sent back over $80 million from the poorest state in the country.
And that was also true for the child tax credit. And the outreach, we had to go on the ground for folks to be able to access the child tax credit. Because again, that was all, we started out electronically, people had moved, money was going into folks' checking accounts that were overdrawn, they were losing the money. So all of these things are stuff we have to do, because ultimately what we're trying to do is get the resources to the people that need it and to the children that need them. So the CDF, what CDF has different than most organizations is the ability to build policy from the ground up to the federal level, to lobby on behalf of federal policy, but also to be able to follow that money back down to the ground. Early on in our work in the region, we had a report that was simply titled, and we worked with Black women across the region, and they said to us, the rain don't fall to the ground down here. So we named the report, The Rain Don't Fall to the Ground. So, this is, it's not a new thing. It's and they want to know, well, why are these people doing better? Because they're not getting anything. They're not getting any consistent help. You say they got to go to work. You say, in order to get Medicaid, you got to do job search every week. Outside of the area where Robert lives in South Mississippi, outside Natchez and Fayette, Jarvis Dortch, who's the head of ACLU, looked at the state's own information about from its employment statistics. There were 2 jobs. In a 10-mile radius. So everybody got to go apply for them same 2 jobs. Say you did job search in order to keep Medicaid. So we were fighting that, and we were successful. They didn't get that waiver. But I want to end. So we say all of this to say, some people look at us and say, why do you stay here? And I say, because I'm just too darn honoring. I'm not going to let you, Mary used to quote Sojourner Truth all the time. And Sojourner was talking to whoever the president was, and he said, Sojourner, I care about as much about what you're saying as an old flea. And she said, well, if the Lord is willing, I'm going to keep you itching. So we just try to keep people itching. But we got to get out of this. So Brandon, will you close us off? And we want to have at least some opportunity for discussion. I know we're bumping up against time. But Brandon, how do we get out of this?
well, I'm sensitive to being a white guy from Mississippi up on the panel talking about these things. I mean, there is this scourge of white supremacy and racism that reverberates through all of these conversations that we're having. It's a disease, and it's not afraid to feed on itself. And so we see that in full view in our Mississippi state government. And it is designed to take away your spirit. It's designed to take away your willingness to fight. It's designed to make you want to give up. And I'm like Macy, I have stopped denigrating people who leave.
Yeah.
I understand that choice. But I also understand that there's so many of us who cannot afford to leave. There's so many of us who don't have that, even that choice at their disposal in 2023. So I think we have to think long and hard about how we define success and what it looks like. And I think we cannot start out by saying we're going to take back the legislature, which we did in another day. But now with redistricting, we have to be honest about what that reality means for us. And so the first thing to me, Olita, is we have to organize and we have to be very smart about who's doing what and to be open and honest and to realize there's no use in us on this side of the things fighting with one another about how we take one foot and put it in front of the other. The other is, even in a state like Mississippi, and we have 1,500 elections on the ballot this year at the local level all the way up to the state level, we have hundreds upon hundreds of local races that are going uncontested, that are competitive by virtue of their Black voting age population, where we are not doing our blocking and tackling to let these people know who's on the ballot, what's the importance of this job, and making sure they are all contested. We can do that right now. We can also organize around the way that the legislature, what you just heard here, and I'm grateful for LBT, public broadcasting, others who are here, but we need to be amplifying that message. It should be an inescapable reverberation of what is happening in that state house that goes out. And so we have to start putting our resources behind blasting that out to white women, which I think some percentage of them are our only persuadable group in the state right now. And we need to make sure that it's inescapable, that they cannot miss this message. It struck me, the only thing that we did to TANF, the only bill we have passed relative to TANF was months after the first indictment came down. Shad White came over to the legislature and asked y'all to pass a bill that allowed for an audit of people's income taxes when they requested assistance. So rather than finding, so it's so much worse as you peel back the onion, rather than looking for some of these, where the money went, how do we make sure that it's getting down? How do we make sure the water is reaching the ground? They attacked the recipients. I think we have to weaponize those stories, because I actually still believe that people by and large would be outraged by some of how we conduct ourselves. But if we haven't mobilized that, if we haven't organized around that, we can't be surprised if people aren't as angry as we are, and if they're not as outraged as we are. So I think for me, the answer relies on us doing our best to figure out how we focus our voices in a way that's strategic and continuous.
Thank you. Any other burning statements from the panel?
Well, just to give you some encouragement. So we don't, Brandon and I tried, 8 years ago to try to take the legislature back. That didn't work. So now we resigned ourselves to just winning 3 seats. If we can get rid of the supermajority in the House of Representatives.
Only state in the South that's close, by the way. The House of Representatives in Mississippi is the one place that's within a 3 seat.
So if we can get rid of 3 votes, we get rid of supermajority and elect a Democratic governor, then we have the strength to not override vetoes. And also, the other thing is working in our favor. The Republicans, Brandon talked about the fact that they are getting better at what they're doing, but they're still pretty bad at what they're doing. The crafting of the legislation is written terribly. The language in it, that 1020, I think, based on the way it's written, is just constitutionally indefensible. 1310, the purging bill that purged the voting rolls in a state that has no mass public transportation, bad roads. You don't let people vote early. You don't let them register by electronically. So all these things are working in a way that's I just still keep holding out hope that these people will stop voting against their own interests, that they'll wake up and say, look, I live in Northeast Mississippi. I don't live in the Delta, but I'm poor too. And I need a hospital in my area. I'm white, but I'm still poor. And so I still need a hospital, and I need doctors, and I need nurses. And so the only way I'm gonna have that is them to take that $1 billion a year. And so what I can tell you is that I think we can win. We can get rid of the supermajority. I think we can elect the governor, but it's gonna take us registering people to vote. It's going to take a real organized ground effort in a Stacey Abrams kind of way here in the state of Mississippi, getting people out to the polls and making it, even though we can't hand them water in the line, give them some water when they get out of the car and have them there. But I think there's a real opportunity, and I feel as depressing as this legislative session was, I feel more hopeful now than I felt in a long time.
Well, I want to thank this panel. And do you all have any, we have just a few minutes. Want to go deep? Yes, sir.
Thank you all for sharing what is so important for us to hear. You use the word fascism.
Yeah.
And it's exactly that. So I want to thank you for
I don't think it's
sharing what you have with us. You use the word fascism.
Yeah.
It is exactly that. And yet it is a conversation that takes place within certain groups, but not widely discussed, particularly for a layman's understanding for how it operates. And based upon what you have described, Mississippi is ground zero for fascism.
Yes.
How do we expand that conversation so that people get it? That's one question. And another question is, what is the conscience index of the state of Mississippi? I ask it based upon Martin King's words. If your enemy has a conscience and could be persuaded morally, go the way of gun, nonviolence. But if your enemy has no conscience, you may need to go the way of Bonhoeffer, who is more radical. And it sounds like we've come to the tipping point, not just in Mississippi, but in this nation, where another strategy has to be considered. The Voting Rights Act gutted, even now where gerrymandering, you can try to elect someone who will represent your interests, and if you have people who then could autocratically say they are not worthy of holding public office, can remove them, can expel them from the state legislature simply for representing the interests of vulnerable people, then it seems like this edifice that we have tried to come into is burning, right? So, yeah, those two questions. What's the conscience index of Mississippi? Because it sounds like it's quite deficit.
We're not doing Gandhi anymore. We're done. we are at ground zero. And I can give you a great, and I don't mean to jump out, but I lived it in the legislature. First thing the chairman of Ways and Means said to me when he showed me 1020, and I said, look, this won't work. This is just bad legislation. As Democratic leader showed him, he said, it's bad. He said, nothing I can do. I said, it's nothing you can do. I said, because you have not had one discussion with an African-American or anybody from the city of Jackson or Hinds County about how does this work? You decided this is what you're going to do. And when he said to me, well, whatever you do when you go out here, just don't call me racist. I wonder if you got to ask me not to call you racist, that means you understand what you're doing is racist.
Yeah.
And so outside of this room, taking it to the street, I never use the word fascist. But what people do understand, I grew up in Natchez. White people in the state of Mississippi, and I've been in the legislature 30 years, and it doesn't matter whether it's Democrat or Republican, even the people who are good, with the exception of the people in this room, the white people that you come in contact with, when they think they're doing something good for you, it's when they are telling you what's good for you.
Right.
And that's always, and I tell people, I say, look, no, you said, well, I'm trying. I say, no, you're not trying, because you haven't stopped to listen and let me tell you what I need. I'm telling you what my community needs. I don't need you to tell me what they need. You know, like tell Jackson, you need more police. That's not what Jackson is asking for. So you didn't bother to ask. So when I take it to the street, I said, look, these are just white people who are racist, and they just want to tell you what to do. And the next thing you know, they're gonna be hitting you in the head with a club, and they may even try to throw a rope up on. Whatever it takes, I go to the extreme to explain to them that's where we are.
Yeah.
This is where we are. This is this paternalistic, status quo maintaining attitude in the state of Mississippi, is that people being as poor as people is fine as long as I can stay where I am.
Yeah.
And that's the division that they want. And as long as I can tell people, look, you remember when we had John, and my example would be Natchez. I tell people Natchez, remember when we had Johns Manville, Armstrong Tire, and International, and everybody had 2 or 3 generations of people who had jobs and they were sending people to college. but we had to fight the Garden Club every year. I'm growing up watching this because they wanted to maintain the antebellum South. We wanted it to be an old bedroom community. We said, no, we want industry. I said, those are the people we're fighting. They want to maintain a plantation mentality, and you got to be ready to overcome that.
Yeah.
The oppressor
That's
doesn't,
the reason I asked the question, because we can all remember Trent Lott was ousted from majority leader in the U.S. Senate because of a hot mic statement about Strom Thurmond's candidacy.
Yeah.
That was a party that had a conscience, or at least a facade of a conscience publicly. Now
We don't have that.
Right.
no.
Yeah.
semblance of a
We
And
don't
they
have that.
enjoy
We're gonna have-
that.
We're gonna have
Spirit,
to start
yeah.
wrapping up. Are there other questions from the board members? Any other?
Yeah, I just want to say, I appreciate that you bringing economics into it. I'm sitting there with Representative Mel White and talking about quoting Economics 101 and wondering how he was so successful for so long. Because at the end of the day, you know, I do feel that people vote with their pocket.
Yes.
They do.
There. And to the extent you can, I mean, these things are all major economic issues.
Mhm.
There's a reason you're for a state.
Absolutely.
And these are not hard lists. And so I appreciate the elected officials bringing that up. So, thank you.
Thanks, Clay. I say all the time, we're real successful at staying on the bottom. We fight real hard
We do.
to stay here. So, thank you. Again, I really appreciate y'all's time. You know, it's hard to get people back when they spend 3 months in the legislature, they need to go practice law.
Yeah.
So we really want to
Got
thank
bills
them
to
for
pay.
taking the time, and I will pass it to Mr. President.
I'll be brief in that. Thanks again, and let you know some of this is one of the rules we talk about on our staff. We're talking about some culture things, is the 5 greatest fears in life. And one of them is an odd one. It's the fear of plopping. Sharing the most of yourself, sharing vulnerable things with people, sharing your hard work and your struggle, and having them do nothing with it.
Right.
Part of our commitment to you is that we won't let what you are doing and what you have shared with us plop. Very intentionally, just share light into some of the board conversations we're having. This is a joint C3, C4 board gathering. So the ways in which you've crafted conversation and information with us, both about policy and about political terrain, helps to feed and provide fodder for our conversations this afternoon in committee meetings and tomorrow at our board meeting that's hybrid, and we'll graft other board members into this conversation. So you are directly feeding into our governance conversations about how we do our work. The second is that, you know, we continue to pull the thread. We'll talk about soon to be released data and the State of America's Children Report, a landscape report of the impact on children's well-being across the country, including state-by-state reports. And our strategy related to that is also informed by the conversations that we're having. So I just want to say, we're not going to waste your time. And we appreciate what you're doing. And you look, you got the best of us in Miss Olita Fitzgerald. So you knew you had the best. I'm just letting you know, she's the best of mine. And she teaches us all the time. And so we're grateful for what you have offered to us. And we look forward to taking what we have learned, integrating into our ongoing conversations for programmatic strategy, for policy engagement, and for how we structure ourselves in governance for the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And then instructionally, Bob.
Yeah, well, I will ask the panel, if there's another room, and I'll ask you if time to spare, and also members of the press. If you want to continue to
Keep this on.
To me,